Grab your popcorn and snacks. Find a comfy spot, take a seat or lie down, and let me transport you to a place of fantasy, ghost stories, ancient legends, odd creatures, alien encounters, and other magical topics. You may even decide to join the conversation. From faraway lands to your own backyard, with a small dash of pixie dust, turn out the lights and open your minds. The journey is about to begin. Hey everybody, welcome to Sunday Reading Day. For some reason this did not click the way it was supposed to. Where's my camera? There we go. Nope, that's not it either. They switched lenses on me. Ah, there we go. They moved it on me. Give me a second to get TikTok started here and away we'll go, guys. Give me a minute. Okay, welcome everybody. I want to welcome everybody. It's Sunday Reading Day. We're a little later than usual. I had an errand I had to run today, so I decided to go a little later. But I want to welcome you all here. I'll be able to see in the chat room. Hello, Chris Cahill. And we're going to be reading from The Spirits of Christmas, The Darkside of the Holidays. These aren't your mama's Christmas stories, okay? These aren't your mama's Christmas stories. TikTok, how you doing? Today's Sunday Reading Day, and we're going to be reading from a spooky Christmas storybook, okay? So welcome. I know there's other people that are lurking out there and hiding. And it's 7 p.m. tonight for everybody that's interested. I'm going to be doing something a little different. I'm going to be doing at least an hour to 2 hours of psychic tarot reading on YouTube. So stick on this YouTube channel to find my other show that I'm going to be doing tonight. And I'm real excited to try that out on YouTube to see how you guys do it and bring those shows to you. But my name is Charlotte. I forgot to do that. Here you're wondering who the hell's talking to me. I'm going to be your host for the next hour or so. I'm also the owner of the California Haunts Paranormal Investigation Team, based out of Sacramento, California. We are 45 strong up and down the state, which means if you have a paranormal need or you think you have a paranormal need, we can get to you. It just might take us a little longer because California is like this huge, huge state. Nobody realizes how big it is. But you can find us everywhere on social media, including TikTok. And I see a bunch of people coming up in TikTok. I got 12 people in the chat room. Yay. Yay, that's good for a Sunday. So anyway, what I'd like you to do is grab your eggnog, grab your hot cocoa, dim those lights, and get some snackies. And we are going to be, I am going to try to scare you. How's that grab you? Tell you some spooky Christmas stories. Also, I do have a goal. I have a goal over on TikTok for 20,000 likes. Plus, I've got a goal of 100 dolphins over there. I'm not going to make dolphin sounds because I'm not doing it for my regular radio show. That's all there is to it. But if you could help me out with 100 dolphins, that would be great. None of the money goes to me. It goes to my paranormal team. So we can, so they can have equipment repairs and things like that. And for everybody that follows us on TikTok, please be sure to tune in because we're going to be taking you ghost hunting. That's part of that money too. Okay, so all I ask for you guys to do is double tap that screen on TikTok for likes. Try to see if we can get 20,000 likes for this. Let's rock. That's right, Chris. And see what we can do with that. Then all I ask, if you don't gift, you're not, like I said, you're not required, but it would be nice if you did. Hang on. Okay. Let me see where you're going. I have my pin thing up here. Okay. Anyway, if you don't gift, just do me a favor and double tap that screen, follow and share. Let TikTok know we're live, okay? All right, let's do this without further ado. And another warning is I cannot see your comments on TikTok, so I'm going to leave it to my moderators because I know there's got to be at least one on TikTok right now. So I'm leaving it to my moderators to banter back with you guys. It's just too far for me to see at this point, okay? But love my story, love my show. Thank you so much. I love my shirt. Thank you. Yeah, it's my Surfing Santa. Got Surfing Santa on today. Okay, so here we go, and I'm going to read at 6:07. It's Pacific time. I'm going to read for about an hour. Chris is on both. Okay, Mr. Multifunctional. So okay, so here we go. Let's read some spooky Christmas stories. And this book is written by Sylvia Shuts. She was on the show Thursday. If you want to catch the replay of the show Thursday, that would be fun too because she was talking about what they call an Utica crib. And a woman that was there for 44 years and had a lot of issues. So here we go. Let's get to The Spirits of Christmas, The Dark Side of the Holidays, everybody. Mary Lud, the Christmas Carol Singing Horse Skull. Mary Lud, it's LWYD, something is Lord. Or the gray mare, is a mischievous party animal. No, really. Marie Laud is nothing more than a horse's skull with a hinged jaw, decorated with ribbons and bangles with colorful reins on its halter. The skull is perched on top of a pole and carried around by a man under a white sheet. Marie Laud travels with an entourage of merrymakers who take Christmas caroling to the new level. The band goes door to door at houses or pubs, because why not, and engages the inhabitants in a battle of rhyming insults. A Yo Mama fight inspired by Dr. Seuss. My dog is, if you hear footsteps, the dog is running out of the room. In theory, whoever stumbles on a rhyme first loses. But Marie Laud is invited in no matter who wins. The theory being that she is so jolly and terrifying that she scares the paste out of any evil spirits that happen to be hanging around the place. She brings good luck for the coming year just by being in the house. In Celtic Britain, the horse was a symbol of power and fertility. Rhiannon, the horse goddess and queen of the underworld, I knew the dog would start up, I knew it, rode a majestic white horse. Horses that had the ability to cross between this world and the next were depicted as white or gray. Battles of wits, too, are common in Celtic literature. I know they're outside. The neighbors are moving around. So the custom of parading Marie Laud in the streets at Christmas is sort of a mini course in Celtic mythology. Stop that. The Grey Mare, dressed in white, returns from the underworld at the turning of the year and engages the humans it meets in a rhyming battle of wits. There was, the Christian Church discovered, just no way to turn Marie Laud from a riotously pagan symbol into a proper Christian celebration. So they denounced her instead, preaching against the drunkenness and bawdy verses. Ironically, stop it! Ironically, the practice of parading Marie Laud through the streets in search of booze and off-color. See, she was behaving until I got on the air. In search of booze and off-color fun had nearly died out by the 19th century when the Reverend William Roberts wrote this book, The Religion of the Dark Ages. In it, he warned against the dangerous shenanigans of Marie Laud and helpfully wrote down 20 of the most common verses, thereby setting the stage for a Marie Laud revival. The tradition of Marie Laud faded through the mid-20th century, but the cheerful nonsense of a dog barking, has since become has come back once again in recent years. Olet Zero, the Basque giant. Stop that. Olet Zero is one of the Dintilac, a race of giants living in the Pyrenees, in the Basque region of Spain. There are two legends of Olet Zero's origins. The first is that many centuries ago, a brightly glowing cloud appeared in the sky over the Pyrenees. It was so brilliant that only one person could look directly at it, an old man who was nearly blind. The old man interpreted the vision as a sign that Jesus would soon be born. He asked the local giants to throw him off a cliff so that he wouldn't have to live through being a Christian. The giants did as the old man asked, but on their way back down the mountain, the giants themselves tripped, fell off the cliffs, and died, all except Olet Zero. Another legend, one that makes slightly more sense, is that Olet Zero was abandoned as a newborn in the woods. He was found by a fairy who bestowed on him the gifts of strength and kindness and gave him to a childless couple who lived in the woods. This version of Olet Zero grew into a good man who would carve wooden toys to give to local children. He worked as a charcoal burner and would tote the handmade toys in a charcoal bag to hand out to the kids. This Olet Zero died saving children from a house fire. When he died, the fairy who had found him as an infant granted him eternal life, so he could continue to bring joy to children through his gifts. Neither of these legends, however, does anything to explain the Basque tradition of throwing a sickle down the chimney to scare kids who refuse to go to bed. If children don't go to bed on Christmas Eve, they are told that Olet Zero will come into the house, snatch up the sickle, and unalive them. We'll just leave it at that so we don't get in trouble on TikTok and YouTube. Karen Kolos, the Turkish Christmas Sasquatch. The Karen Kolos is a tall, hairy, ape-like figure that stalks Bulgaria and Turkey. In Turkey, it appears in the first 10 days of Zemheri, the dreadful cold. In other words, the bitter heart of winter, from December 22nd to January 2nd. In Turkish folklore, the Karen Kolos imitates the voices of loved ones to lure people outside into the cold night. The Karen Congolos hangs out on street corners at night and snags passing strangers to ask them odd questions. If you refuse to answer, the Karen Congolos will strike you dead. So it's in your best interest to just go ahead and try to come up with an answer. And make sure the word black is somewhere in your reply. In Bulgaria, the Karen Congolos are kept at bay by the custom of kukri. This involves dressing up in funny costumes and putting on bells to scare away evil spirits, including the Karen Congolos. All right, guys, here's where we get into like these things I can't pronounce. All right, Kali Kantazaroi, the holiday demons of Armageddon. The Kali Kantazaroi are Greek demons who can vary in appearance. Sometimes they are described as gigantic hairy demons with a pair of horse legs and boar tusks, and at other times they're just described as small black satanic-looking imps. They are said to eat frogs and other adorable woodland creatures. According to Greek folklore, the Kali Kantazaroi spend most of the year living underground, sawing at the trunk of the world tree. The world tree's trunk connects the earth to the heavens and keeps the heavens from crashing down on the earth. In other words, the Kali Kantazaroi spend all year long trying to destroy the world. They are usually nearly finished on Christmas Eve, but they are allowed to come up to the Earth's surface during the 12 days of Christmas. So at dawn on Christmas Day, the goblins come topside and wreak all kinds of havoc, mayhem, and murder, if they can get away with it. Fortunately, for the world's continued existence, the damaged trunk of the world tree heals itself completely during the time the demons are away on the surface. On January 6th, the demons return to the underworld and start their destruction of the tree trunk once more. Any child born within the 12 days of Christmas runs the risk, when reaching adulthood, of turning into a Kali Kantazaroi themselves. The antidote for this was to swaddle the baby in wisps of straw or braids of garlic, and to singe the child's toenails. Luckily, there are ways to protect yourself against it. One is to leave a Yule log burning for all 12 days of Christmas, so the demons can't enter your house through the chimney. Another method is to toss a pair of smelly old shoes onto a fire. The stink of burning sweat and shoe leather repels the demons, possibly because it reminds them of the stink of the underworld. Another way to protect yourself against the murderous creatures is to leave a colander on your doorstep. A Kali Kantazaroi can't count above 2, because there is a holy number pronouncing it will make the demon explode. So it sits on the doorstep all night, trying in vain to count the holes in the colander, and completely forgetting that it wanted to get into your house to kill you. Werewolves, not just on the full moon. Werewolves have actually been part of the Christmas horror scene since the Middle Ages. Klaus Magnus, a Swedish folklorist, wrote in the World Encyclopedia of Christmas that werewolves gathered on Christmas night to rage with wondrous ferocity against human beings, attacking their homes and devouring the inhabitants in Prussia, Livonia, and Lithuania. Even in modern times, the belief persists that simply being born on Christmas Day can turn someone into a werewolf. As explained in the 1961 film, The Curse of the Werewolf, being born on December 25th is a mockery of Jesus Christ and therefore deserves punishment, as if being totally messed up on birthday presents isn't punishment enough. Yes, Virginia, there is a Santa Claus, but Santa is not only supernatural, being out and about during the Christmas season. Okay? The darkest time of the year is a perfect place for all kinds of monsters to hide, so you better watch out. There are fates worse than a stocking full of coal. In the black midwinter, unsettling things that happen in the dark of the year. The sun sets early these days, and many things can hide in the shadows of a long winter's night. The chill in the air can seep right into your bones if you're not careful. So don't wander too far from the safety of the hearth. You never know what might be lurking in the frozen depths of winter. The Christmas tree ship. The Christmas tree was introduced to America from Germany in the mid-19th century. In the beginning, presents were wired to the branches of the tree instead of being placed underneath it. Small boxes of candy and other treats were used to festoon the tree, and it was further decorated with tiny lit candles. By the late 19th century, the custom of decorating a tree for the holidays was firmly entrenched as tradition in America. And by the early 20th century, ship's captains in the Great Lakes were doing a booming business delivering Christmas trees. Schooners would pick up a load of trees from northern Michigan and in Wisconsin in mid-November, just before the coming winter storms and ice made travel on Lake Michigan too hazardous. They would bring those trees to towns along the shores of the Great Lakes. In Chicago, most vessels sold trees directly from their berths along the Clark Street docks on the Chicago River. The crews of the schooners would decorate their vessels with electric lights strung from bow to stern, turning the entire schooner into a floating Christmas ornament. Most of these operators sold their cargo to wholesalers and stores, but other captains invited their customers to come on the ship and choose their trees from the selection on board. Stepping onto such a boat must have been a true delight. The soft glow, the sparkle of the lights, the sweet fragrance of evergreens, the anticipation of choosing the perfect tree. In addition to the Christmas trees, there were wreaths, garlands, and other holiday decorations, often made by the wives and children of crew members to help the family holiday business. One of the captains of these beloved ships was Herman Schuenmann. During his long career as a late-season tree captain, he commanded several schooners that carried Christmas trees to Chicago, including the George Wren, the Mary Collins, and the Bertha Barnes. The Schuenmanns lived in a German neighborhood in Chicago, on Clark Street. This was a perfect location for a ship's captain, as there were many sailors in the community from which to choose a crew. The Germans and Scandinavians of Chicago were seafaring men, the blood of their Viking ancestors still rich within them. Some of the residents of this neighborhood were third and fourth generation mariners. Schuenmann had his share of adventures and misadventures as a Great Lakes captain. His ship, Mary Collins, sank when it crashed into the shoreline in upper Michigan. Since it sank in shallow waters, all on board were rescued, running into shore. Kind of makes Captain Schumann, rescued. Running into shore kind of makes Captain Schumann sound like a complete idiot, but he really wasn't. What happened was this. At Thompson, Michigan, the harbor master kept a light burning on the south dock to help navigation. The pilot on the Mary Collins said, "There's Thompson," and steered straight for it, assuming he was headed into the harbor. But this particular light happened to be a kerosene lamp shining out of an upstairs window in a log cabin, 1/2 mile east of Little Harbor. The Mary Collins was indeed wrecked on the limestone shore, but since the water was shallow, everyone on board was saved. Misadventures aside, Schuenmann was an experienced mariner and spent over 50 years sailing Lake Michigan. Somewhere along the line, Schuenmann was given the affectionate nickname Captain Santa. He came by the jolly title honestly. His slogan was, "The Christmas Tree Ship, my prices are the lowest." Not the catchiest of advertising phrases, perhaps, but what he lacked in originality, he made up for in generosity. Christmas trees sold for between 50 cents and $1, and many Chicagoans celebrated their holiday with a tree purchased from Captain Santa. But Schuenmann also gave trees away to poor folks on the waterfront and to the city's churches. The newspapers got wind of this habit of Schuenmann's, and reporters looking for a heartwarming story for the Christmas season wrote articles on the captain's charity. Schuenmann was intensely proud of the nickname he'd earned over the years. He clipped the articles out of the papers and kept them safe in his wallet. In addition to making sure everyone who boarded his ship went away with a tree, Captain Santa made sure they had a hearty meal as well, served on board the vessel. These meals often included roast boar and venison as the main course. Herman Schuenmann, in his role as Captain Santa, was in good company. His older brother August was also a Christmas tree ship captain, working from 1876 to 1898. August, too, had earned an affectionate nickname for his diligence in bringing trees to the people of Chicago, Christmas Tree Schuenmann. He lost his life when his schooner sank in November of 1898, on a run from Michigan to Chicago, carrying a load of pine spruce and balsam. August and Herman had been exceptionally close, and Herman very much admired his older brother. August's loss only made Herman more staunchly determined to carry on the family tradition. In fact, not 2 weeks after August's ship, the Esthal, was lost, Herman made an extra run up to Michigan for a load of trees to replace the cargo that was now at the bottom of the lake. He knew the people of Chicago wanted their trees, and he knew he was the man to provide them. Schumann couldn't afford to buy any of his schooners outright. For that matter, neither could August. There was no shame in this. Most of the sailors that worked the Great Lakes were not in a position to own their own vessels, and it was common practice for captains to band together and buy shares in a schooner. In 1910, Schumann bought a share of the Ralph Simmons, and by 1912 his interest had grown to 1/8 of the ship's value. The ship had been built specifically for Lake Michigan's lumber trade and was named for its major financial backer, Ralph Simmons, founder of the Simmons Mattress Company. The Ralph Simmons spent her entire life as a lumber ship. Over the years, she carried shingles, lathes, planking, railroad ties, telephone and telegraph poles, and cedar posts. The Ralph Simmons was purpose-built to serve as a lumber hauling ship, but she was nearing the end of her useful life. Built in 1868, the schooner was already 42 years old when Schumann acquired a share in her. That didn't bother him in the least. It meant she was a bargain. An older ship was not necessarily a liability in the lumber trade. In fact, Schumann had built his career on buying shares in older vessels and squeezing the last bit of use out of them. Lumber was a popular cargo for these older ships, for several very practical reasons. If the ship was leaky, lumber was a cargo that wouldn't be damaged if the ship took on water. Even Christmas trees wouldn't be bothered by a slosh or two of lake water. Also, the inherent buoyancy of the wood may have helped these schooners make port safely in a fierce storm. As for the ship's age, well, what better way to use a ship in her declining years than bringing Christmas trees and happiness to hundreds of people every year? Partial ownership of the Ralph Simmons was important to Schumann for another reason. The captain made his living on the lake, but in the off-season, especially in the winter, when the Great Lakes were lashed with storms, he, like many other lake boat captains, turned to other businesses to supplement their income. In 1906, Schumann owned, among other businesses, a saloon. Unfortunately, not all of these businesses turned a profit, and the saloon forced Schumann into bankruptcy. On January 4th, 1907, he filed, and the debts to his creditors amounted to over $1,300. Schumann looked to his other businesses to bolster his finances. Herman owned 240 acres of wooded land in the upper peninsula of Michigan, where he harvested trees. The Schumann's spent part of every fall, about 8 weeks or so, in their woods, selecting and felling the most beautiful of their trees. Schumann also bought trees from Michigan locals, including Chippewa Indians living along Lake Michigan and Lake Superior. The Christmas tree trade also provided late-season employment to area lumberjacks. The bolstering of the local economy continued when Schumann reached Chicago. He would set up sewing machines on the deck of his ship and hire 50 women to make wreaths and garland from the boughs that filled the hold. These 50 women would, by Christmas Eve, have made over 60,000 feet of garland. By 1912, Schumann was one of the last Christmas tree merchants who still shipped his trees by a schooner. Railroads were regularly used to transport trees by this time, and Captain Schumann was not unaware of the benefits of shipping trees by railway. In fact, that's how he got the trees from the forest to the shoreline to load his ships. And Barbara Schumann would often take the train home to Chicago as Herman left Thompson to wait for him at home. But Schumann felt that he was honoring the tradition his German neighbors and so many others had come to enjoy, the romance of stepping out onto the gently rocking deck of a ship to choose their Christmas tree for that year. Plus, the wind to fill the bellying white sails of the schooner was absolutely free. On November 22nd, 1912, the Ralph Simmons left Thompson, Michigan, loaded with 5,500 evergreens for the final voyage of the season. November had the reputation of being a bad month for travel on the Great Lakes, but a Christmas tree merchant had little choice but to chance the trip. There was a storm brewing that was predicted to hit sometime during the week-long voyage, but all in all, November 1912 had been relatively quiet, weather-wise. Schumann had a good reason for taking a chance and making this last Christmas tree run. Snow had already fallen on the tree farms in Michigan and Wisconsin. Other lake captains were spooked by the possibility of nasty weather. Schumann hoped that this combination, leery competitors and a general shortage of trees, would lead to a huge profit for the year and solve his money troubles. So at noon, the Ralph Simmons sailed from Thompson Harbor, crammed with trees. Reports later varied as to how many men were on board, in addition to the captain and crew. The ship carried several passengers as well. Schuenman had kindly invited some lumberjacks to hitch a ride with him back to Chicago to celebrate the holidays with friends and family. None of the men would live to see that Christmas. The bad omens had started earlier that day. While loading the ship, the sailors noticed that rats were deserting the ship. Some recalled that rats had bailed out of the ship in Chicago, too, as she was headed up to Michigan. The Ralph Simmons was scheduled to set sail on a Friday, bad juju for any voyage, and the horseshoe nailed to the davit post had worked itself free of one of its nails, and was now hanging with the tines pointing straight down, letting all the luck run out. That night, a storm overtook the schooner. Knowing that the lashing winds and cresting waves were a concern, Schuenman sent two sailors up to the deck to check that the trees were all secure. A rogue wave swept over the deck, and the two men were knocked overboard, along with some bundled trees and a small boat. Schuenman had little time to mourn the loss of the two of his crew. Since the schooner was slightly lighter, he thought he could make landfall. He steered for the safety of Bailey's Harbor, but the storm was growing more furious and deadly by the minute. Spotters at two United States life-saving stations, an antique version of the modern Coast Guard, saw a ship they thought was the Ralph Simmons on November 23rd. It limped past Kewanee, Wisconsin, its distress flags flying, its sails and rigging crusted with ice. The crew at Kewanee saw it first and telephoned the crew at the two rivers to the south. The rescuers at Kewanee only had rowboats, and by that time, the storm was a fierce gale. They knew it would have been impossible, suicidal even, for them to brave the tempest. The station at Two Rivers had a gasoline-powered surf boat, and was better equipped to handle a rescue attempt in the teeth of the storm. But by the time the power boat motored out to look for the ship, the Ralph Simmons was nowhere to be seen. The crew of the rescue boat, led by Captain George Soag, could see nearly to Kewanee, but there was simply nothing to see. The rescue boat ran 8 miles north, then headed out into the lake for an hour. They found nothing. No ship, no signals, no wreckage. By that time, the snow was starting to fall, more heavily. Soon it was snowing so hard they could hardly see from one end of their 34-foot-long boat to the other. One of the rescue crew, Oscar Anderson, later recalled her fear of being run over by the very ship they were looking for if she happened to rise up before the wind. So the little powerboat headed back to Two Rivers, its crew heartbroken at the failed rescue. The storm grew even stronger. Several ships were lost besides the Ralph Simmons. The storm that battered the Great Lakes starting in the late night hours of November 22nd, 1912, did not spare land either. The storm morphed into a blizzard with high winds. The winds did severe damage in Chicago, blowing in windows and stripping shingles off roofs. A Lincoln Avenue streetcar narrowly escaped being crushed when a sign 50 feet high was blown off a building on Fullerton Avenue. A few days later, a bottle washed up on the lake shore at Sheboygan. It had been corked with a small chunk of pine wood. Inside the bottle was a rolled-up piece of paper bearing the last sad message from Captain Santa. Friday. Everybody goodbye. I guess we are all through. During the night, the small boat washed overboard. Invalid, and Steve, lost 2. God help us. Another note was found washed ashore near the end of July 1913. This one was purportedly from Captain Charles Nelson, the first mate of the Ralph Simmons. It read, November 23rd, 1912. These lines were written at 10:30 p.m. Schooner Ralph Simmons, ready to go down, about 20 miles southeast of Two Rivers Point, between 15 and 20 miles offshore. All hands lashed in one line. Goodbye, Captain Charlie Nelson. Both of these notes, it must be said, may be hoaxes. As much as people wanted closure, it's difficult to imagine a sailor fighting for his life against blowing wind and frigid water, his fingers crusting with freezing snow, taking the time to scribble a note, stuff it in a bottle, after finding an empty bottle, whittle a cork out of the pine, and chuck the bottle overboard. Besides, the second note, the one attributed to Captain Nelson, sounds awfully specific. Hoaxes or not, these possible final grabs of communication with solid land were the last real information anyone would have about the fate of the Ralph Simmons for many years. Christmas trees started to wash up on the shoreline for years after the wreck. Trunks from some of these trees were sliced into rounds and turned into ornaments. A Christmas tree was painted in the middle of each circle. with the words Ralph Simmons, 1868 to 1912, carved below. It's fitting that instead of being enjoyed for just a single season, some of the trees Captain Santa had been bringing home on his final voyage now served as family heirlooms, living well beyond one holiday and being enjoyed for countless more years. In 1923, a fisherman working near Two Rivers, Wisconsin, brought up Schuenman's wallet, wrapped in oilskin, in his net. Oddly enough, the fishing boat whose net snagged Captain Santa's wallet was named the Reindeer. Inside the wallet were business cards, an expense sheet, and a newspaper clipping about Captain Santa. On Friday of the same week, the wallet was found. Captain Manville LaFond of the fishing tug Monitor brought in a much grislier relic in his nets, a human skull. It was the third he'd found, and that's not counting the entire skeleton he saw tangled in his nets once. The skeleton fell to pieces as the net was being hauled aboard, and the bones sank beneath the waters again. The full story of the fate of the Ralph Simmons wasn't known until 54 years later. On October 30th, 1971, a diver from Milwaukee named Kent Bell-Richard discovered the wreck in 165 feet of water, 12 miles northeast of Two Rivers. An archaeological study of the wreck painted a clearer picture of the schooner's final hours. The windlass was in the middle of being prepared to lower the port side anchor. Something went wrong, and the crew was trying to hold the schooner into the wind by dropping the anchor. But given the depth of the water and the amount of chain, it would have been impossible for the ship to anchor safely in the lake. It's also known that the Ralph Simmons was dangerously overloaded with trees. Some reports indicated that the schooner was riding very low in the water when she left Thompson Harbor, laboring under the weight of the trees in her hold and on her decks. It's quite likely that the estimated 8-foot-tall pile of trees on her deck destabilized the schooner and led to a domino fall of events that ended with the vessel sinking. When the ship was found, archaeologists noticed right away that the navigational wheel was gone. They wondered what had become of it. After all, it weighed 400 pounds. Parts of it were steel and parts cast iron. It couldn't have gotten far from the wreck site. When the wheel finally did turn up, dragged to the surface in a fishing net, one of the mysteries of the wreck was finally solved. It had long been theorized that the actual wreck was caused by the bundles of trees on the deck, getting encrusted with snow, and freezing like spray, and turning into blocks of solid ice, which then tore loose and turned into deadly battering rams, ripping the wheel off and leaving the ship, with no steering capabilities. When the wheel was finally discovered, the restorers found that many of the handles of the wheel were catastrophically bent, with some missing altogether. The truth was revealed at last. With a new theory, the mizzenmast driver boom, that's the support for the mainsail, had snapped its rigging, then swung wildly until it crashed into the wheel. People had wondered for years why the Ralph Simmons didn't put in at Two Rivers, and why the rescue boat from that station had never been able to locate her. The reason Captain Schuenman didn't steer for safety was because he couldn't steer for safety. As Rochelle Pennington, author of the historic Christmas tree ship, put it, once the wheel was gone, the Simmons was fighting for its life, with both hands tied behind its back. Divers to the wreck of the Ralph Simmons say that the trees are still stacked in the hold. If you look closely, you can see that the trees lower down into piles still have their needles attached. The loss of the Ralph Simmons marked the beginning of the end for schooners in the Christmas tree trade. These lovely, graceful vessels were the last survivors of the golden age of sail. Schooners like the Ralph Simmons were a dying breed, already being pushed aside by the march of progress in steam technology. By 1920, the Christmas tree trade on the Great Lakes was all but extinct. But here's the amazing thing about this whole story, even better than August Schumann being called Christmas Tree Schumann, or Herman picking up the nickname of Captain Santa. With the tragic loss of both men, August in 1898 and Herman in 1912, the women and their families carried on their legacies. Barbara Schumann was determined that her husband's good works should not die with him. W.C. Holmes, who owned a Chicago shipping company, was a good friend of the family, and Herman had been commanding his ships for years. Holmes donated the schooner Oneida for Barbara and her daughters to use to sell trees just a couple of weeks after the Ralph Simmons was lost. Herman's old daughter, oldest daughter, Elise, was selling trees from the deck of the Oneida when she was interviewed by the Chicago Inter-Ocean newspaper on December 11, 1912, when news of the sinking was still fresh. Before setting off from Thompson, Herman Schuenman had sent 2 railroad cars of ships to Chicago. These, in addition to the trees washed up on the shore, represented the stock which Barbara and her daughters sold that bleak Christmas of 1912. Some of the trees that washed ashore were brought to Chicago as well, and sales of those trees were used to benefit the families of the sailors lost when the Ralph Simmons went down. The next year, Barbara and her daughters were once again on their property in the Upper Peninsula. They chartered another boat, appropriately named the Fearless, and carried on the Schuenman legacy. And 1 year after the loss of her husband, the Chicago Daily News interviewed Barbara Schuenman for their November 28, 1913 edition, as she was preparing to load her schooner with Christmas trees. Barbara made her desires clear. We'll load the trees on it and tie up at the old dock, and our customers will come to us as they have in former years. They know where to find us. The Rouse is gone, and her captain is gone, and the crew is gone. But Christmas will find the survivors still on deck, and Chicago will have her Christmas trees as long as the Schuemans last. It was a promise Barbara kept. She celebrated her last Christmas in 1932. Pastor Jacob Pfister wrote this tribute. She is here to help bring joy this year like never before. She dispenses Christmas trees. You all know her. It is good Mother Schuenman, the widow of ill-fated Captain Schuenman, the Christmas ship man, who never returned to the shores, but with his great cargo of Christmas trees went down into the deep on that terrible night of storm. And since then, Mother Schuenman has felt the urge to carry on. Barbara Schuenman passed away in June 1933. The Chicago Tribune printed her obituary, which included this comment: Mother Schuenman was known and loved by thousands of hundreds of thousands throughout our great metropolis. After Barbara died, her daughters Elsie, Hazel, and Pearl continued to carry on the business for a few years more. The Christmas tree ships no longer sailed Lake Michigan, and the trees were brought in by rail. But the store at 1641 North LaSalle Street, quaintly and poignantly named Captain and Mrs. H. Schuenman's daughters, still did a brisk business during the holidays. The 3 sisters lived in a grand old Victorian house that had been divvied up into separate flats just a short walk across the street and down the block from their store. And the oldest daughter, Elsie, also picked up a nickname bestowed upon her by the grateful people of Chicago. An accomplished sailor in her own right, she proudly carried on her family's legacy of bringing trees to the city. By the time she was married in 1917, Elsie had become known as the Queen of Christmas Trees. She and her husband, Arthur Roberts, were married in a church, right next to a huge Christmas tree. Elsie herself had brought the wood that she had brought herself from the woods. Over the years, the disappearance of the Ralph Simmons spawned legends that grew larger with time. Many sailors on Lake Michigan swore they saw the doomed schooner, her sails and rigging crusted with ice, still trying in vain to complete the trip to Chicago. Rochelle Pennington, author of the historic Christmas tree ship, writes of a conversation she had with Joyce Phippen. Mrs. Phippen was a retired teacher who lived in a small stone cottage on the shore of Lake Michigan, right next to the water. She said she had seen the Phantom ship twice, once at dusk, once at night. She described the ship as just sort of there, floating in the air, hazy, ice-laden, misty, and white. Barbara Schuenman, Herman's widow, was laid to rest in Chicago's Acacia Park Cemetery. Visitors to her grave claimed to have smelled the distinctive scent of evergreens in the air. The story of the wreck of the Ralph Simmons holds a special place in the lore of the Great Lakes. Other ships were lost during the storm on November 1912, which many lake captains swore was the worst snowstorm they'd ever seen. But the Ralph Simmons was special. It was the Christmas tree ship, piloted by the beloved Captain Santa. The crew of this ship were willing to risk their lives to bring holiday cheer to the people of Chicago, even to people who couldn't afford to buy a Christmas tree. The legend and legacy of the Christmas tree ship lives on even today. Every year, the U.S. Coast Guard cutter Mackinac makes the journey from northern Michigan to Chicago, bringing a load of Christmas trees to deliver to the city's poor. All right, the Black and Blue Boys. Winters in Wisconsin are long and brutal. I gotta move this a little bit because I gotta see the clock. There we go. The winter of 1840 was particularly bone-chilling. not only because of the bitter cold, but also because it was 1840. It was in 1840 that a bar fight took the lives of two teenage boys, and the legend of a terrifying haunting began. Ridge Road in southern Wisconsin was a 25-mile stretch of old military trackway. The mining communities of Blue Mounds and Dodgeville sat at each end of the road. Ridgeway, another mining camp, sat roughly in the middle between the two towns. At least a dozen saloons operated along Ridge Road in those days. Rowdies from the mining camps at both ends of the road frequented the taverns. These were rough places, and rough men hung out in them. Bar fights were inevitable, with beatings, knifings, robberies, and even unalivings being commonplace. One winter night in 1840, two young men, barely into their teens, had the sheer bad luck to stumble into one of these bars, a dive called McKipp's Saloon. They discovered far too late that it was a clubhouse for thugs and bullies, and they were not welcome there. The boys had been out in a bitter winter night, no one knows why. When they saw the welcoming yellow glow of firelight through the tavern's windows, they hurried to get into the warmth of the crude building. Anything, even the dubious welcome of a saloon, would be better than suffering a moment longer in the biting cold outside. They found a welcome, but not the one they'd hoped. Instead of stopping at an inn for weary travelers, the boys had walked into one of the savage bars on Ridge Road, a place where life was cheap. The boys had been there just a short time, hardly long enough to melt the snow off their boots, when the trouble started. One of the local tough guys pretended to take offense at the little pipsqueaks hanging out in his bar. The tavern was full of rowdy, drunk, belligerent miners. Barely any excuse was needed for a bar fight. The two teens were terrified at the mayhem they'd caused, just by trying to get warm on a freezing winter night. Cowering in terror, they were utterly unprepared for the violence that raged around them. Sensing weakness, the bullies attacked. Okay? Now, guys, do not turn me into the internet police on this, okay? This is a book. I'm trying to clean it up as I go. Do not turn me into the TikTok police or anything like that, okay? This is a book. One miner grabbed a younger boy, punched him in the stomach, then brought a knee up into his face when the boy doubled over. Frantic with pain, blood streaming down his face, the boy swung wildly. A lucky hit smacked his attacker in the eye, and the thug shrieked with rage. He grabbed the boy by his shirt front and threw him into the huge fireplace. The boy stumbled and fell, landing in the middle of the brightly burning logs. Flames snapped, and the glowing red logs came apart in a shower of sparks under the boy's weight. His clothes caught, and he was burned. He was unalived. The older brother stood stunned for a moment. His hands clapped over his ears to drown out the sounds of his brother's screams, his eyes wide open with helpless horror. Then he realized his own danger. He ducked and weaved to escape his attackers and made it to the door just ahead of the grasping hands. He yanked open the door and stumbled out into the darkness, sobbing. A few days later, his unalived body was found in a nearby field. Sadly, he had escaped the bar fight only to freeze to death that night. No one ever found out who the boys were or why they had been wandering Ridge Road that night. But the boys took their revenge, and soon everyone knew their tale, if not their identities. From 1850 to 1910, the two unalived teens made Ridgeway their hellish home. The phantoms were so dangerous that soon people began to travel in groups, fearing to be alone on the road after dark. The boys didn't care who they attacked either. No one was safe, and those they attacked at night were lucky if they survived the encounter. The unalived boys were fiendishly inventive in their attacks. They appeared in a wide variety of shapes. They took the form of a herd of pigs, or a flock of sheep, or a pack of dogs. Sometimes they took human form, manifesting as a man with a whip. Headless men, women, young and old, even as themselves, burnt black and frozen blue. One brother even attacked a man in the form of a ball of white-hot flame. Even with these vicious attacks being common knowledge, some skeptics dismissed the idea that the unalived boys were behind them. John Lewis was one of those who scoffed at the idea of savage ghosts. He was a butcher by trade, and he was known throughout the state as a champion wrestler. He earned the nickname the Strangler because of his fondness for chokeholds. John Lewis was a fearsome grizzly bear of a man, and he was not going to be cowed by figments of other people's imaginations. Lewis was headed home one night after helping a neighbor with his butchering when he had his encounter with the Ridgeway ghost. according to an article in the New York Times, published on December 7th, 1902. Lewis was crossing a field when he was confronted by a dark, shapeless mass that moved to attack him. A neighbor later found Lewis half delirious, propped up against a fieldstone wall. He said he had been thrown up into the air and whirled around as though he'd been sucked into the middle of a tornado. The neighbor helped Lewis home, half carrying the big man. A few hours later, Lewis died. To the end, he swore that he'd been the victim of a supernatural attack. In 1910, the town of Ridgeway caught fire and was largely destroyed in the blaze. Some say the sightings of the Ridgeway ghost ended after the 1910 fire. Others claim that the hauntings have continued and that they follow a cycle of roughly 40 years, escalating into the 1890s, the 1930s, and the 1970s. Sightings were reported as late as 1993. The two teenage ghosts may still be out there, waiting for an unsuspecting traveler to happen by. All right, next story. Ghost Rider of the Revolution. How's it going, TikTok? How's it going, everybody? I see Marisa and Chris in the chat room tonight, and I'm sure there's some of you lurking out there that I'm unaware of, so listen on in. Welcome, everybody. The winter winds whistled around the cabin in the South Carolina woods, but inside the snug home, all was well. The cabin's owner, David Miles, was a Quaker, and he held himself and his family aloof from the fighting that raged around them. The Revolutionary War, get out of there. The Revolutionary War was a necessary evil, but Miles prayed it would not touch his two teenage children. 19-year-old Charity, David's daughter, heard the light hoofbeats of a horse just outside the rear of the cabin. Her heart leapt as she jumped up from her chair, leaving her knitting forgotten on the table. A sharp knock on the door brought her father and brother to their feet as well. Charity eased the door open, just a crack. Young Henry Galbraith, a scout with the Continental Army, stood outside. Charity grabbed his hand and pulled him into the safety of the cabin. Tears, both of joy and worry, stood in Charity's eyes. "Henry, I almost wish you hadn't come. It's too dangerous. You can't keep coming here, not with General Tarleton's redcoats patrolling the area. You know I love you, but you must stay away." Henry bent and kissed Charity. "I can't, love. I have to see you or I'll go mad. Besides, no one knows these woods better than I do. I'll be safe, I promise." David Miles pulled a chair closer to the fire, and the young patriot plumped into it with a grateful smile. Henry enjoyed the company of Charity's family, and he loved Charity. After this war was over, after the Americans won their freedom, he'd make Charity his wife. Charity poured 4 mugs of chicory coffee, and Henry wrapped his cold fingers around his mug, happy for the warmth. He gazed up at Charity. "My love, I'll come back for you 1 year from now. Whether or not the war is over, I will come back." Charity nodded. "I will wait for you, Henry." David took a sip of his coffee, then stiffened. Over the sounds of the wind, he'd heard the pounding of horses' hooves, several of them. The Tories were out searching for the young scout. Henry tossed his coffee into the fire, and Charity hastily dried the mug on her apron and threw it into the cabinet. Her brother rushed to the back of the cabin and, with the skill of long practice, removed a plank from the wall near the floor. Henry squirmed through the opening into the backyard, where the horse waited. Scarcely had Charity's brother replaced the board when a barrage of knocks came on the cabin door. Rough voices called out, "Open up, in the name of King George." Gun butts smashed against the door, which sagged inwards under the blows. 3 Tories burst into the cabin, their muskets held at the ready. "Where is he?" one of the soldiers demanded. David Miles, still seated by the fire, closed his Bible and calmly took a sip of coffee. "I have no idea who you might be looking for. My children and I are the only ones here." A flurry of fading hoofbeats, and the soldiers knew their prey was lost. They mounted up and thundered after the scout, but the thickly falling snow hid his tracks well. The fighting dragged on. Weeks turned into months, with no word from Henry. Even the Continental soldiers who sometimes passed through had no news of him. One night, Charity was sitting up late after her father and brother had gone to bed. Henry's words still echoed in her heart. 1 year from now, I will come back. It hadn't happened yet, because the year hadn't gone up But she longed to see Henry again, no matter the danger. She reached for her shawl and stepped out of the cabin. She felt oddly drawn to the edge of the clearing. At the edge of the woods, a strange bluish light began to glow. Raising her hand to her eyes to shield them, Charity saw movement in the light. A rider came galloping out of the woods. He was dressed all in black, the better to blend into the shadows. He was riding hard, intent on some urgent business. He didn't stop at the cabin, but urged his foam-flecked horse onward. The rider hadn't even glanced at Charity, but she knew him anyway. At that moment, she knew Henry Galbraith was dead. 5 long years passed. The revolution began in hope and ended in victory. David Miles and his family gave thanks that the terrible war was over. One December night, 5 years after they'd last seen Henry, the family was once again enjoying a cozy winter evening. Charity still carried a flame of hope in her heart. Maybe she'd been wrong about the identity of the ghostly rider. Maybe the ragged rider and his sweating horse had been a trick of the moonlight. She put on a new dress and joined her father and brother, hoping that evening Henry would keep his promise and return to her at last. The cabin door slammed open, and a shining light filled the room. Henry Galbraith stood in the brilliance. His army uniform hung in tatters from his broad shoulders, and his eyes were raw sockets in his haggard face. His ghostly gaze fell on Charity, and she cowered in terror in spite of herself. Then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, the spectre was gone. Charity Miles never did marry. She never found out for certain what happened to her Henry. Being a scout, his whereabouts were often unknown. It was assumed that he had been killed in battle. The cabin in which Henry Galbraith pledged his love to Charity Miles is long gone. But legends say that when winter winds blow cold on a December night, and the snow falls thick, a ghostly horse and rider still gallop through the woods, forever carrying the news for Washington's army. Now here's an interesting one that I thought was interesting. I have a good friend who lives in Vermont. Okay? This one's called Vermont Resurrections. One of the most disturbing stories in this part of the book has no ghosts at all. I think you'll find that the creep factor more than makes up for the lack of spooks. An article appeared on the front page of the Montpelier Argus and Patriot on December 21st, 1887, titled A Strange Tale. The article was written by a contributor whose byline was noted only as AM. The events of the article took place in a small mountain town about 20 miles from Montpelier, Vermont. Vermonters are a frugal people, and this particular bunch had discovered a way to ease the hard times of winter by reducing the number of mouths that needed to be fed during the cold, cruel months. They developed a technique that was part Vermont folk medicine, part Yankee thrift, and part outright creepy weirdness. A.M. wrote that the following tale was excerpted from his Uncle William's diary. January 7th. I went on the mountain today and witnessed what, to me, was a horrible sight. It seems that the dwellers there, who are unable to, either from age or other reason, to contribute to the support of their families, are disposed of in the winter months in a manner that will shock the one who reads this diary, unless that person lives in that vicinity. I will describe what I saw. 6 persons, 4 men and 2 women. One of the men, a cripple, about 30 years old. The other 5 past the age of usefulness, lay on the earthly floor of the cabin, drugged in insensibility, while members of their family were gathered about them in apparent indifference. In a short time, the unconscious bodies were inspected by several old people who said, "They're ready." They were then stripped of all their clothing except a single garment. Then the bodies were carried outside and laid on logs exposed to the bitter cold, the operation having been delayed several days for suitable weather. It was at night when the bodies were carried out, and the full moon, occasionally obscured by flying clouds, shone on their upturned ghastly faces, and a horrible fascination kept me by the bodies as long as I could endure the severe cold. Soon the noses, ears, and fingers began to turn white. Then the limbs and face assumed a tallow look. I could stand the cold no longer and went inside, where I found the friends in cheerful conversation. In about an hour, I went out and looked at the bodies. They were fast freezing. I could not shut out the sight of those freezing bodies outside, neither could I bear to be in darkness. But I piled on the wood in the cavernous fireplace, and seated on the shingle block, passed the dreary night, terror-stricken by the horrible sights I had just witnessed. A common grave had been dug for the bodies, before the ground had frozen. The corpses were placed side by side on a bed of straw in a 10-by-6 wooden box. When they were judged ready, the helpers placed the cloths over their faces of each corpse, and packed more straw around the bodies. The wooden lid was fastened securely under the box. Then the box was lowered into the pit and covered with a layer of straw, Then a layer of branches to keep the scavengers away from the bodies. In the weeks that followed, the Vermont winter set in with its accustomed fury. Snowdrifts up to 20 feet high buried the sleepers for the next 5 months. January 8. We shall want our men to plant our corn next spring, said a younger-looking woman, the wife of one of the frozen men, and if you want to see them resuscitated, you come here about the 10th of next May. The narrator was sickly fascinated by the whole process, and when spring rolled around, or greening up as they called it in Vermont, he just couldn't stay away. He had to come back to see the grisly results of the winter's experiment. May 10th. The men commenced work at once, some shoveling away the snow, and others tearing away the brush. Soon the box was visible. The cover was taken off, the layers of straw removed, and the bodies, frozen and apparently lifeless, lifted out and laid on the snow. Large troughs, made of hemlock logs, were placed nearby, filled with tepid water, and in which the bodies were separately placed, with the heads slightly raised. Boiling water was then poured into the troughs from kettles hung on poles nearby, until the water in the trough was as hot as I could hold my hand in. Hemlock boughs had been put in the boiling water in such quantities that they had given the water the color of wine. After lying in this bath about an hour, color began to return to the bodies, when all hands began rubbing and chafing them. This continued about another hour, when a slight twitching of the muscles of the face and limbs, followed by audible gasps, showed that life was not quenched and that vitality was returning. Spirits were then given in small quantities, and allowed to trickle down their throats. Soon they could swallow, and more was given to them when their eyes opened, and they began to talk, and finally sat up in their bathtubs. They were then taken out and assisted to the house, where after a hearty dinner they seemed as well as ever, and in no wise injured, but rather refreshed by their long sleep of 4 months. It's not clear whether this was an isolated incident, or if this was something that the people did on a regular basis. The story was revisited for Vermont Magazine in the 1930s. Editor Judson Hale, famous for his tales of New England, wrote that he spoke with a Vermont farm couple that had heard of the macabre practice. Surely folks of the 20th century wouldn't put any stock in such a wild tale. Hale asked the couple if either of them really believed the frozen death story. Certainly do, the husband replied promptly. Then the wife added, the only part I doubt is the thawing out. Okay. Next story. And this is a girl that has my name, so here we go. Frozen Charlottes. Creepy, eh? Creepy, creepy, creepy. That's what we're doing. Creepy holiday stories. I'll be the first to admit that dolls, especially antique dolls, can be really unnerving. But there is a certain Victorian era doll that has a backstory that takes creepiness to the next level. These dolls were made from one piece of unglazed porcelain, rather than the usual bisque limbs and cloth bodies of fancy dolls of that era. They were pure white with only a tiny bit of color. She's in the other room. In their eyes, lips, cheeks, and hair. They were originally made in Germany in 1850. Since they were made of porcelain, without any cloth parts or stuffing, they were first marketed as children's bath toys. But their minimal coloring and immovable limbs soon inspired another interpretation. In 1843, the poet Seba Smith wrote a poem titled Young Charlotte. It was first published in the Rover, a Maine newspaper, on December 28, 1843, with the gruesome title, A Corpse Going to a Ball. The ballad was based on the true story of a young woman who had frozen to death while riding with her boyfriend on New Year's Eve, an incident reported in the New York Observer in 1840. The poem was a cautionary tale about the dangers of vanity. Charlotte was a fashion-conscious, flighty young thing. She lived with her family in the mountains with no close neighbors, so she didn't have much opportunity to socialize. So when she was invited to a New Year's Eve party with her sweetheart, she jumped at the chance to show off her new silk gown, made of the latest fashion, a low-cut number, which displayed her bare shoulders. She climbed into the open sleigh and settled herself for the ride to the party. Her mother tried to talk Charlotte into putting on a cloak, but the young lady refused. After all, no one would be able to admire her lovely, fashionable gown if she was covered up with a cloak. The 15-mile ride to the party was a cold, bitter journey. The night was frigid, and the wind whipped around the seats of the open sleigh. Several times, Charlotte's beau offered her the use of the warm bearskin robe he kept in the back of the sleigh. Each time she refused, as her voice grew fainter. As they neared the party, the boyfriend slowed the horse. He was concerned, as he hadn't heard a sound from her for the past half hour. At last they reached the house where the party was being held. The boyfriend brought the sleigh to a stop and reached for Charlotte's hand to help her down. Her hand was icy cold. During the ride to the party, she'd frozen solid. The small porcelain dolls, with their removable white limbs, soon became known as Frozen Charlottes. The dolls cost 1 penny, and they were ridiculously popular. Many were even sold with their own miniature coffin and shroud. That's something you're not likely to find in Barbie's townhouse. All right, guys, I'm going to read. That's it for now, and that's it till next week. Let me mark this page. Whoops, wrong button. See if I can mark the page. There we go. Nope, that's not the page. Give me that. I'm trying to, yeah, there it is. Okay, that'll be doing it till next week. I thank everybody for coming tonight and listening to these wonderfully gruesome stories. That's one thing with this book. They're not just it's not your usual ghost stories, you know. It's not what you're going to find for usual ghost stories. So we'll continue next week. It'll be back at the usual time at 5 p.m. Pacific. Okay? But I thank you, everybody. Now, for those of you on TikTok who would like some free tarot card readings tonight, I'm going to be testing out, because as we know, TikTok is kind of dangling. We don't know if TikTok's going to be with us past next month. So I'm trying to find another place to go to do the readings and stuff for you guys. So I'm going to be over on my YouTube site at 7 p.m. Pacific. Okay? And I'm going to say it out loud. It's youtube.com/@CaliforniaHauntsRadio. I'm going to be going live at 7 p.m. Pacific for an hour or 2 hours doing some free readings. So 3-card readings, past, present, and future. I'm going to be doing those. So come on over and join me and see if we can have some fun with that and see how it goes over on TikTok tonight. I'm over at YouTube tonight. And then I'll be back on TikTok tomorrow at 7 p.m. Pacific doing my usual readings. Okay? As far as guests go for the show, I do have a guest scheduled this week. That's going to be a surprise guest, and that's going to be kind of iffy on guests because I didn't get a chance to look for guests last week, so I'm going to be looking for guests tonight, get some letters out. So a week from tomorrow, we're going to have more guests. But that's where we're at this week. There's a stupid puzzle. Hang on. And there's no puzzle piece. Okay. So anyway, I'm glad everybody came tonight. Thank you for listening, and the stories get to be fun. You know, the stories are grim, but they're, like it says, it's you know, the dark side of Christmas. That's what this book's about. So we're going to be looking at the holidays and stuff for the next few weeks. Okay? Thank you, everybody, for coming. And TikTok, I will see you on youtube.com/@CaliforniaHauntsRadio at, 7:30 p.m. Pacific. I screwed up. So in a half hour, I'll be there. This is how my day's been. 7:30 p.m. Pacific. I will see you over at youtube.com/@CaliforniaHauntsRadio, and we're going to be doing some free card reads. Okay. All right. I'll see you then, TikTok. Now. Okay. Okay. And now for you guys over here on YouTube and Facebook, if you want to join me at the YouTube site for some free tarot card readings tonight, come on over and join me. I'm going to do past, present, future reads, and it's free. We'll do it free tonight, and we'll see how it goes on YouTube. And you guys know the link. It's youtube.com/@CaliforniaHauntsRadio. Come on over and see us. All right, guys. I'll see you then, and 7:30. Bye. Grab your popcorn and snacks. Find a comfy spot, take a seat or lie down, and let me transport you to a place of fantasy, ghost stories, ancient legends, odd creatures, alien encounters, and other magical topics. You may even decide to join the conversation. From faraway lands to your own backyard, with a small dash of pixie dust. Turn out the lights and open your minds. The journey is about to begin.